Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Transit has been sort of, one of those issues, I guess, behind tariffs and immigration and stuff like that, but that has been top of the news with the departure of the CEO of Metrolinx, with the delay of the Eglinton Crosstown, with frustration over, delays on here in Ontario. It's transit and what's going on is a topic that beguiles lots of us. John Lorinc is a writer and a freelance journalist and an editor. He specializes in cities, climates, and technology, and he's contributed to numerous national, local publications. I read him in the Globe and Mail frequently, and he's an expert on what's going on in transit. And so I thought it'd be great to check in with him. John, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Brian.
So tell me, what's going on with transit and this recent study about the drivers of transit construction costs in Canada? Why is it so expensive? I saw this quote that they built the channel in for less money and less time than it is to build a tunnel under Eglinton.
Yeah, well, I'll give a closer to home analogy. The Bloor Danforth subway line, the original one, which extended from, I think, Kipling to Woodbine, took 6 years to build, and in 2023 dollars cost $2 billion. So a more complicated project right through the spine of the city, and for half the time and a fifth of the cost or a sixth of the cost. Um, I think there are lots of things that are contributing to the to this run up in in the cost of transit and in the complexity of the transit projects and in the time it takes to build them. And just to kind of go into a little bit. And so what I'm citing here is a study that the University of Toronto School of Cities released a couple days ago, which really kind of peeled a lot of the peeled the onion and tried to sort of look at what was, why things are working so slowly in Toronto. And so there are a number of reasons. One is that um, we have, we have this very congested, if you pardon the pun, system of letting contracts. So back in the day when the TTC was building subways, they had an internal construction department. They managed their construction projects. So these were not built by TTC employees, but they were designed by TTC employees and engineers. And then they outsourced the construction to, different companies. They built the line, they passed it back to the TTC, and the TTC would start operating it. So what we do these days is that Metrolinx, which is in charge of all capital projects in the GTA, says, okay, well, we want to do an LRT here or a subway there. There's a lot of backing and forthing about cost and so on. Eventually, they get down to sort of something that's approximating a route and some preliminary design. And then they say, okay, well, here we need Infrastructure Ontario, which is an agency of the provincial government, to come up with an RFP, a request for proposals, to entice private sector consortia to build these lines. And the way they want to entice these consortia is they offer, additional elements that previous generations of subway construction didn't have. You could do the financing, for example. You could own, you could be responsible for operating the thing or maintaining it. So there were all these sort of perks that are added on that are intended to add to the profitability of building these things. And consequently, what you have to do is you have to create a package that allows for all that extra profit margin to be built into the cost of the transit project. We didn't do that before. It was just simply a contract.
Built it before.
We just built it. Um, uh, Also, the other important thing is that this process is all being done outside the transit agency, which in this case is Metrolinx. It's being done by another agency, um, Infrastructure Ontario, which is also responsible for building basically anything that needs to be built in Ontario: hospitals, courthouses, highway expansions, you name it. Anything that needs to be built goes through Infrastructure Ontario. So all of these very large transit projects are competing for time and resources with these other projects. it's a very congested model. And so eventually they give it back to um, Metrolinx to, with a winning consortia. And but the consortia may not be working as closely with the transit operator as would be desirable, right? So you have you have you have three entities that are kind of at this the old joke, there are three people in this relationship. In this case, there are like several people in that relationship, and they don't all talk to each other. In the case of the Eglinton Crosstown, there was a lot of legal jousting between Metrolinx and the consortia that went at like years and years of legal fighting over, expanding the scope of the project and changing the terms and this kind of thing. There are all sorts of technical issues that have arisen because the consortia and Metrolinx did not work with the TTC, which is the operator, which will be ultimately the operator of the line. Um, so you can see how, with each sort of iteration, it becomes more complicated. I mean, there are other drivers as well. Our engineering standards are just much more stringent than they used to be. Most of the subways in most big cities that you travel on that are older than 50 years old, you couldn't build them today because they don't have they're not built to spec. They don't have accessibility, all of that stuff built in. They tend to be over designed. This was one of the things that came out in this report that U of T did, is that because of liability concerns, that they build the tunnel thicker than is absolutely necessary in order to prevent any kind of liability issues down the road. That adds cost. And then the final element is that, and this sort of goes back to this strange procurement model we have, which is that there are a lot of consultants that have their fingers in these projects, and they're expensive. They can run up to a quarter or even more of the total cost of the project. And these are called quote unquote soft costs. Um, and every big construction project, even a small construction project, even a renovation on your home, you have consultants, you have an architect, you have a structural engineer, and so on. But the way that we structure these deals encourages more and more consultants to be brought on. And the sort of the countervailing problem is that a lot of the transit agencies are constantly under pressure to, reduce costs. So they they don't have the in-house capability anymore to design these things. They rely on consultants. So you have a vicious circle there, and that's what drives up the cost, and that's what creates these delays.
Is the Eglinton Crosstown ever going to open?
Well, I mean, I think it's going to open eventually. The TTC announced this week that it was preparing to kind of take on the line, right? To begin to operate it. They're going to be training their drivers to operate those LRT trains, which are not like subway trains. And I believe they set a deadline of mid 2025 to be prepared, right? So that's on the TTC side of it. Metrolinx still has to hand it over. And Metrolinx is doing all this testing for safety purposes. So, probably 2025, but, we'll know when we know.
We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in just 2 minutes with John Lorinc, talking about transit in the Greater Toronto Area and why it costs so much. And already he's given us a taste of some of the incredible challenges and some of the things we've done wrong. And let's delve into that in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I got John Lorinc with us today. He is a transit expert, a city expert, a writer, an author, and someone who knows a lot about what's going on with transit. John, I've got to ask you about a couple of things. It sounds like the whole idea of Infrastructure Ontario was a mistake, yet people thought that it was going to be the solution, that the centralization of procurement was like this big, wonderful change, and private-public partnerships were this big, wonderful change. And I've heard stories of tens of millions of dollars, if not more, of litigation issues between different partners and Infrastructure Ontario and Metrolinx. And I've had, smart people that know something about transit saying this is a procurement problem, a litigation problem, and a political disaster. What do you think about all that?
I basically agree. I think that what we're doing is we're depending on a government agency to build all the things that need to be built in Ontario that relies on a model that is basically, was very fashionable in the late 90s and the early aughts, which is the public-private partnership. And the public-private partnership idea is driven by an assumption, which is that the private sector, if it's given the proper incentives, will be able to deliver these big projects on budget and on time in a way that public sector agencies like the TTC were unable to do. And so that was the idea. Just to sort of, unpack that a little bit more, um, it's this concept, it's this notion, and, not entirely unfounded, that, private companies have, a profit motive, they have efficiency in their operations and so on, that government bureaucracies may not have. And so that was the idea back in the late 90s and the early aughts. And uh, it was kind of given form through the establishment of Infrastructure Ontario. And its mandate specifically is to, create these triple P arrangements with private firms to build, to build infrastructure in Ontario, and to, offer various inducements to get these companies involved, and to get the stuff built, on time and on budget. Now we know 20 years later that these, we have not got these goals. They don't come in on time. They don't come in on budget. And I think that it's really, it's past time to ask why we're persisting with this model. Like, this is why we wanted triple Ps, to get stuff built on time and on budget. But if it's not being built on time and on budget consistently, like like really consistently, then why are we taking this approach? What was wrong with the previous approach? Or are there ways of doing it differently? And I think that these are questions that need to be asked because
Is anyone asking them?
well, nobody's asking them. I mean, not nobody's asking them. I mean, people are asking them. I know a lot of people who, pay attention to infrastructure who ask these questions, but I don't think the government is asking them. And I don't expect the Ford government to be asking these questions because Infrastructure Ontario, pumps out an enormous amount of business for engineering firms and for construction firms. And so it's kind of a cash cow for a large sector of an important, part of our economy. And so there are a lot of vested interests involved in preserving the status quo.
The CEO of Metrolinx has left recently and replaced by, I understand, someone from Infrastructure Ontario. Does that compound the problem?
Well, I think that so the person you're talking about is Michael Lindsay, who is the CEO of Infrastructure Ontario. I mean, I don't know if it compounds the problem. I think that I don't think it does anything to change the issue. I expect that Metrolinx will hire a permanent person to be the CEO at some point, a transit operator. Michael Lindsay is not a transit operator. But it's not, there's no evidence there that they're trying to figure out what went wrong.
So Phil Verster came in with, an incredible transit background from around the world, did he not? He was going to be the expert that was going to be able to solve things. What happened?
Well, I think that the issue is that structurally, the system mitigates against success, right? So you have somebody like Phil Verster who has a great resume, and has built, transit in other places. But if the system produces, what it did in the case of Eglinton Crosstown, which is a four company consortium where the four players fight with each other. They fight with Metrolinx, they fight with the TTC. Um, there's nothing he could do about that, right? That is a structural issue that goes back to the model that we use for building transit. And it's not a model we used, um, you know, in earlier major construction projects. And I want to point to one in particular, which is the expansion of the Yonge University subway line up to Vaughan Metropolitan Center, which was completed, about 10 years ago. It didn't come in on time and on budget, but it was nowhere near as over budget and as delayed as the Eglinton Crosstown. And that was a subway project, and it's not an LRT. So, and it was managed by the TTC and it was financed by by York Region and the City of Toronto and the provincial government. Uh, and it was more of a traditional kind of transit project. Uh, and the ones that we're building now are not. They're the sort of products of this Infrastructure Ontario Triple P model. And we know what's not working.
And the same model, I understand, was used on the Hurontario LRT, and now people are talking about it being delayed over budget. And the word that came out this week is that the cost estimates were underestimated and the ridership estimates were overestimated, and so therefore the losses supposedly are going to be substantially more than were projected. And the city of Mississauga is worried that they're going to have to fund it all, and are looking for the provincial government to come in and bail them out.
Yeah. So what's going on there is that you have this, well-recognized problem where, politicians will approve projects based on numbers that are probably underestimates because it's easier to sell those, right? If you take the truth in advertising approach to large capital projects, none of them would ever get done because they're very expensive. So it's not surprising to me that the cost was underestimated. Then, there are drivers like inflation and other factors. And there's also, in the case of the Hurontario line, there was a lot of political fighting over, the route and the corridor and so on. And so so there are a lot of factors that cause these things to get delayed, plus the congestion at the other end, which is the tendering process. So it's a recipe for disaster.
A recipe for disaster. Wonderful. What about the Ontario line? It's the same process, is it not?
So the Ontario line is slightly different because so the learning that Infrastructure Ontario and Metrolinx took away from the Eglinton Crosstown is that instead of giving the whole line to one consortium so putting all your eggs in one basket, they cut it up into sections basically. And the idea there is that you're not dealing with you're not you don't have a gun pointed to your head, right? That you have like a bunch of different companies that are working on different parts of it. It's an incredibly complicated project, and it was it was moved along quite quickly for the front end of it, right? Because the Ford government, got religion on this line. They renamed it from the Downtown Relief Line, and really pushed past some of the public consultation aspects that were holding it up. But once you're in the ground and tunneling and dealing with all the engineering issues, and then that's going to take a long time. And the issue with that line is that it has to go underneath or over parts of the Don Valley, which is difficult. And so it's a complicated project, and I think it would be wishful thinking at best to assume that it will come in on time and on budget.
Wishful thinking at best. So what, 0% chance?
I I don't know. I can't, I would be wrong to make any kind of prediction about it. I do have a bet with a sports reporter about what happens first. Do we get the Ontario line, or do the Leafs win the cup? So I think that we're both waiting on the
Waiting
outcome.
and waiting and waiting. Good
Yeah.
analogy. So I've been told that part of the problem is that it was sort of this attitude, not just on public-private partnerships, but in sort of a procurement process that always went with the lowest cost. And so therefore there was this, several different bids. You had to take the lowest cost. And so therefore quality and working together with other parts of the system weren't the big criteria. and that these contracts ended up being very involved, and that litigation ends up being a big issue coming out of that process because everyone is so close to the margin on the cost. What do you think about that?
I think that that describes what I've heard about the Eglinton Crosstown situation. Um, and the practice of lowballing bids is well known, right? This is how a lot of firms get public sector contracts. And, if you think about, I'm sure many of your listeners will have had the experience of, putting an addition on their house or rebuilding their garage or something, and they get a quote. And then the general contractor comes in and they start building stuff and they said, well, Mr. Crombie, I'm afraid that, we discovered something in the basement that we didn't expect there. And, the cost of lumber now has just gone up. And so you're constantly getting, a bit more, a bit more, a bit more. And, if you take that dynamic and then expand it, by multiple orders of magnitude, you get the situation that you're seeing on these big projects. Um, and I think that's a natural dynamic. But what's unnatural about it is that the is that you is to have this situation where the contractor and the agency that's asking for the work to be done are constantly fighting with each other. And those fights are about cost, right? Because they bid low, then they say, okay, well, we need to tunnel under under some river. And the consortium says, well, you didn't ask us to do that, so you're going to have to up our fee. And the agency says, well, you should have known that when you were putting together your design. And so there's a lot of that kind of sort of chirping back and forth, and it ends up in the courts. Uh, and that's that becomes an enormous delay. And whenever you delay a project, you make it more expensive because the cost of materials goes up, the cost of labor goes up, everything goes up.
And there are numerous litigations going on between different parts of the consortium and Metrolinx and Infrastructure Ontario. Is that not correct?
Yes, that's what I've heard.
And so I heard that there's going to be over $100 million, if not more, in litigation expenses.
Yeah. And so just to put that number into context, so the uh, in the late aughts and early 2010s, there was quite a lot of controversy around the creation of streetcar right of way on St. Clair West, in through Midtown Toronto, and that project was originally going to be like 70 or $80 million. It turned out to be about $120 million. It was delayed for a couple of years because there were local groups that took them to court, or took the TTC to court. In the end, it cost about $100 million to do that project. The $100 million, or whatever that litigation number is, let's put it into context. It's a huge number. It's like a huge number. You can build like a lot of housing for that amount of money. In terms of the context of the the Eglinton right of way, it's now a $13 billion project, right? So we're talking about a few percentage points on top of the cost of that. And I think that, for a lot of people, a lot of, members of the public, their eyes glaze over when they see all those zeros, right? It's like it stops meaning something, right? Like what's the difference between, a billion and 10 billion, right? It's just so abstract. And, so once they get into these kind of giant numbers, these agencies and the consortium, uh, really there's no stopping that process because there's no political pushback. And it's just, it just drives up the cost.
But like a lot of litigation, some people think it'd be a lot easier, quicker, smarter to settle. And yet, from what I understand, there's not a process in politics or in infrastructure and terror to actually think about settling. It's easier to just fight because then you can blame, well, the judge, I lost it in front of the judge.
Well, and I think that I mean, I think that you know, the the consortia understand their positionality in all of this. They know that they know how much pressure there is on the government to, to get it done. I mean, a month doesn't go by when there isn't a story about the Eglinton Crosstown delay. And, we'll see that, in the Finch LRT delay and the Huron-Ontario delay. And so, so the lawyers for the consortia know, right, that they're holding the cards, right? They're standing between the government and the completion of these projects. And so they've got leverage. And I think that they're using that leverage. And I think that this is the problem with that model that you would not have if you were in a very traditional, um, you know, contracting mode, right? Where TTC hires Ellis Dawn to build a tunnel, and then you have to build the tunnel, goes over budget a little bit, finish the tunnel, hand it back. And we don't do that anymore.
So what's the solution? Do we just get rid of Metrolinx, get rid of Infrastructure Ontario, and go back to what you described? We're going to take a break and come back in 2 minutes and talk to John Lorinc about what the heck do we do now? Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're chatting with John Lorinc. He's a author, he's a writer, he's a city and transit expert, someone who I love reading, and sir, it's a real pleasure to chat with you because I've always wanted to, and so thank you very much for joining us today. We've been talking about the problems with public-private partnerships, with litigation, with change orders that you end up having to litigate about rather than just pay. What's the solution? Should we just get rid of Metrolinx and get rid of Infrastructure Ontario, get rid of private-public partnerships and go back to the model that the TTC used 50 years ago to build subways?
I don't necessarily think that we should be nostalgic about that model, but I think that we would be wise to look at what worked about that model and what didn't work and try to figure out how to get to that place. I personally think that Infrastructure Ontario has outlived its usefulness. And if anyone was listening to me, I would say that the time has come to sort of begin to wind down that operation. I mean, I'll ask, your listeners could think about this. The Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care wants to build a long-term care facility in Mississauga, which is the thing that's happened. And so instead of actually just saying, okay, we know we need 1,000-bed facility, and we've got this piece of land, let's just do it. They have to now do a sharp right turn and go to Infrastructure Ontario and wait for their process to kind of, work itself out, and then wait until that's finished, and then, sort of take delivery of this long-term care facility. So what I'm saying is that, we need to cut out that middleman, that government middleman, and allow the ministries that are in charge of these different projects to just do them themselves, right? Which means staffing up, means hiring project managers and engineers and architects and so on, rather than depending on a very congested approach that drives everything through a single agency. And I would say that the same principle would apply to Metrolinx, right? So Metrolinx, I don't think that we can't get rid of Metrolinx. Metrolinx is a major transit operator. It runs GO. It runs Up Express. It's the transit operator for much of the GTA, except for the city of Toronto. And we need it. What we don't need is for Metrolinx to have to do this dance with Infrastructure Ontario. I would argue that Metrolinx should get back into the business of, really creating the projects that has approval to do and executing them and doing it by themselves, instead of relying on this third party. And that's the fix. You don't get rid of government agencies overnight, right? You can't just turn them off. But I think that, there's a lot of projects in the pipeline. The U of T report identified 11, I believe, worth over 11 billion, $10 billion or something like that. So yeah, a lot of projects. So you begin small by bringing those projects back in-house. So getting Metrolinx to do them, and then building up their expertise, building up their in-house resources to carry out these projects, and then eventually wean them off of the triple P model that Infrastructure Ontario has imposed on the transits, the sort of transit policy, um, uh, you know, program of the provincial government and of regional governments. That's, I think, what would be a rational way of going about it.
I had a opportunity to participate in a debate over dinner one day with a transit consultant from London, England, who I think was very experienced worldwide in transit, and we ended up talking about, the transit organization in Mississauga, in Vaughan, in Markham, all around the GTA, and we talked about, should you go with centralization and should Metrolinx take over all of them? And I think it was at the time when there was some talk about the TTC and Metrolinx combining. And he said that in London, there's something like 20 or 19 different organizations, some public, some private, that all somehow work together and share revenue and figure out how to connect. And then he went on and said the Elizabethan line, which is this cross town that was built in London, was over budget and over time, but still got built reasonably quickly and opened reasonably quickly in time for the Olympics. And in 2 years after opening, has paid itself back because it's such a popular. So what are we doing wrong? Is it this over desire for centralization versus what London, England seems to do with different bus agencies, train agencies, subway agencies, et cetera, that all seem to somehow work well together?
Well, I think that it's important to point out a really salient difference between what London and other big cities have and what exists here, which is that generally speaking, the upper orders of government do not contribute a sufficient amount of money to the operation of transit in the Greater Toronto Area as compared to other places. So Transit for London, for example, which operates the whole of London's transportation and transit infrastructure, they have access to all sorts of types of revenue. And the national government, pours money into these big capital projects like that, like the subway line you're talking about. And they do it because it's important to the regional economy that that people are able to get around, goods are able to be shipped, in a timely way, all of that stuff, right? So, in the past couple months, we've heard, some really absurd um, ideas for fixing congestion in Toronto, building a tunnel under the 401, right? A project that, your great-grandchildren would not see completed and would bankrupt the province, right? It's an absurd idea. For my money, ripping out the bike lanes in Toronto, in order to deal with the problems that are created by other issues, like construction delays and so on. So what these other big cities do is they recognize that investing in transit, a sufficient amount in transit, is key to the economic health of the region, right? New York City, for example, they just, the governor of New York kind of did a flip-flop and a second flip-flop, and they've allowed congestion pricing in Lower Manhattan now. And it's also about, creating a revenue stream that will support the operation and maintenance of the New York City subway system, which is hugely important in that city's life. We don't do that. I think about at some point in the middle of the McGuinty era, there was a big debate about whether Metrolinx should have access to other revenue streams, right? In order to pay for these big construction projects. And eventually the province said, no, the province kind of got cold feet about it, and they came up with something that was sort of very watered down. And the result is that you have, the agencies that are responsible for delivering these projects have to search for all sorts of other ways of getting them done, right? So, if you only have hammers in your toolbox, right? Then you search for a hammer, and the only hammer in Infrastructure Ontario's toolbox is triple Ps, right? So they say, okay, well, we're going to do a triple P. It's going to get done quickly and for less money. But now we know that that doesn't happen. So, if you if you really want to look at this from 40,000 feet, you have to say the federal government, the provincial governments have to invest more in transit in major metropolitan areas, as is done in all major metropolitan areas in around the world. And that creates enough of a cash flow to build these projects in a way that is that where they can be expedited, right? Where there's, where the agencies themselves have the funds to, have all the in-house expertise and not depend on consultants and so on. And, then you get out of this, this dynamic where you're, in for a penny, in for a pound, right? This is the problem that we have, right? Is that once these hugely expensive projects, kind of get out the door, you can't pull them back in again, because you're in for a penny, in for a pound. Rather design it properly and, not sort of load it up with all sorts of extra features to entice, private investors, and just, do it in a traditional way. And I think the University of Toronto report that came out this week really was a clarion call for getting away from what we are doing. And, one of the things that they talked about in this report, and this is a really good, objective measure, is comparing the cost per kilometer of for construction in the Greater Toronto Area with lots of other cities around the world. And we do incredibly poorly on that score, right? So it just costs us so much more to build a kilometer of LRT or build a kilometer of subway. And they say, okay, well, let's look at what that cost consists of. And it turns out that a lot of that cost goes to, external consultants and all sorts of soft costs that are loaded on because of this triple P model. And, we now, I mean, this is not an advocacy group that came up with this report. These are four academics, one of whom also works for Metrolinx. And, so you say, okay, well, that's pretty good empirical evidence that something is wrong and something should be fixed. Our government in Ontario is a fiscally conservative government, apparently. They should be interested in finding more efficient ways of spending taxpayer dollars. And, these dollars that are spent on these projects are so huge that, there really is an imperative on the provincial government to listen and say, okay, well, saving billions of dollars makes a difference in people's lives, right? It makes, it's more long-term care beds, it's more teachers, it's more, all sorts of things. And that's what they should be doing.
So John, if Doug Ford calls you up and says, I'm going to appoint you Minister of Transportation, but give you the power to change what you need to change within the Ontario government to fix transit, what would you do?
I would say I would tell him that, to let the Ministry of Transportation, do those projects in the way that it's done before, instead of siphoning them through Infrastructure Ontario. Right? I mean, we have an enormous highway system, right? It's well maintained, keeps expanding. And for the bulk of the life of that highway system, that was all done by the Ministry of Transportation. Worked, right? We have, we built subways in this
But
conventional
all
way.
that construction of those highways isn't done by construction workers that work for the Ministry of Transportation. They
No,
work for
no,
the same companies that are doing the Eglinton Crosstown.
absolutely true. But those contracts were let in a very traditional way.
They're cost plus.
Coming, what?
They're cost plus.
I mean, they're cost plus, but they don't involve like all these extras, like, operations and maintenance and all these pot sweeteners, right? So, imagine if you're let's go back to the analogy of the, adding an extension to the back of your house. So instead of hiring, an architect and a general contractor to build that thing, you hire a design, build, and maintenance firm. So, you're actually going to pay for some other company to take care of the back of your house in perpetuity. Doesn't make any sense, right? Why would you do that? And this is the problem with that triple P model, is that to get these big companies, these big engineering companies, to come and bid on these projects, they have to add pot sweeteners. They have to just keep loading them up with incentives, and that means adding, you know, building in profit for the contractors, instead of just doing the job.
Instead of just doing the job. Okay, so we're getting rid of Infrastructure Ontario. Anything else?
Uh, well, I mean, since you asked, I mean, if you, you know, there was some really interesting stuff that came out of the Auditor General's office this week, and so Infrastructure Ontario, has a starring role in the Ontario Place fiasco. And there, you have pretty good evidence of, mismanagement of a very significant public project. With the result that, it's going to be over budget by $2.4 billion. $2.4 billion. You could build a whole transit line for that. And again, more evidence that that agency is just adding complexity and cost and delay to building Ontario. And we need to have politicians asking why. I want to hear Bonnie Crombie asking why. I want to hear Merritt Stiles asking why. I would love to hear something more substantive out of the Ford government about why they've the old joke about, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results, right? So, I mean, we're there. That's where we are,
Are we
right?
not asking why
We're
enough?
not asking
Strongly
why.
enough?
No, no. What happens is that the auditors general, or, something comes out that's critical of one of these projects, and IO Infrastructure Ontario says, "Oh, okay, we're going to fix this and this and this," uh, and and then we just continue in the same pattern, and in the case of the transit projects, the blame tends to end up with Metrolinx. Not Metrolinx is not blameless in this, but Metrolinx is dependent on a model that's not serving its institutional interests. And nobody's asking that question.
And I presume you, as transit czar, would not build a tunnel under the 401. Is there something you would do from a highway standpoint?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of discussion. I argued this in a column a couple months ago about the 407, and I think that the I think an easy fix that they could do, like the by the spring budget of 2025, is to just zero rate every freight vehicle on the 407, do that deal with the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan and the other owners of the 407, and say, we're going to use, the province can use its own fiscal capacity, right? It can spend and say, okay, well, we're going to compensate you, X million dollars to allow trucks to go free on the 407. And, it's like you get two bangs for that buck, right? Trucks get to drive, on a relatively uncongested route, which allows them to save, shippers money, all of that stuff. And it does reduce to some extent the congestion on the 401. It takes some of that pressure off. To me, it's like, it's so easy and obvious. And all it takes is an allocation of capital, or an allocation of the operating budget to cover that cost. I don't know why they wouldn't do that.
John Lorinc, thanks so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks so much, Brian.
I'm going to take a break and come back with some of my own thoughts on this issue of why we're over budget, why we're behind time, and delayed and mismanagement, I think, in Infrastructure Ontario, Metrolinx, and transit and transportation around the Greater Toronto Area. Stay with us, everybody. Back in 2 minutes. Thank you, John Lorinc. Appreciate it.
Should I stay on the line?